Consciousness and technology. One of the greatest lies that are perpetrated in our times has it that technology is a mere value-free, objective expression of human consciousness. On this reading, human consciousness is, in effect, modern consciousness, the consciousness of the modern Cartesian ego. What does modern consciousness involve? It involves the establishment of a rational society and a logic that sustains it, what we call modern rationalism. We learn of a scientific method, but this is just a tip of an iceberg. Now, modern rationalism is, or carries within itself, a progressive optimism. It calls for infinite progress, even though the infinite may very well turn out to be simply indefinite. Knowledge is understood in terms of accumulation. There is no anamnesis in Platonic terms, which is to say that knowledge is not about returning, it is about expanding, advancing, and affirming the freedom of the modern self, the ego of Cartesian ideology, shall we say. Now, the problem of a fate of humanity arises on the basis of this modern consciousness. Is there a fate of humanity? And the modern Enlightenment, the early modern Enlightenment, opens the door to this vision of a fate of the human species. It calls for universal enlightenment, universal light, the triumph of modern rationalism. By the time we get to the 19th century, what we have is a proclamation or an exposition of modern rationalism in terms of will. We see this already in Kant, we see this in earlier instantiations with the early prophets of the modern world, but we see this more and more with the 19th century, where we have modern reason exposed in terms of will. This will needs to be grounded. And Nietzsche, for one, seeks to ground modern rationalism, or the power of modern reason, in a greater cosmic power. So it is, in effect, not God, of course, not a Christian God. It is the power of a machine, or mechanically structured and functioning impersonal power. Nietzsche, of course, speaks of the will to power. Our will is as a reflection, as an expression of the cosmic power, will to power. It is fundamentally geared toward expansion. Now, this involves, in our contemporary terms, the notion of a conquest of space. Conquest of space is an expression that echoes the more general one of a conquest of nature, which really involves the conquest of fortuna in Machiavellian terms, or the conquest, more simply, of death. Now, these terms are interchangeable in modern discourse. Who is conquering what? The modern self is conquering its own past, that into which it tends to fall back. We all tend to fall back into the past, death, nature, space, we could say. We disassemble. We are reduced into space. We could be ghosts. We can dissipate, fade away. So the conquest of nature is really something that involves the administration of that shift into the past. The resistance to that shift, we're no longer condemned to fade into the past. So we must work hard to transfer ourselves into a certain vehicle that will allow us to endure. Not merely our children because they fall into the past, but a machine that does not fall into the past. Hence the rise of AI, artificial intelligence. Now, this is precisely where consciousness converts into technology. Consciousness enters into technology. Technology is not a mere expression of, never mind a tool, of modern consciousness, and never mind of consciousness as such. It is that into which modern consciousness develops or unfolds or transfers itself. Modern consciousness transfers itself in a machine. It is helpful here to consider a prior alternative to this transfer of consciousness into technology, into a machine. In classical antiquity, throughout centuries really, we have kind of perhaps deluded heroism. Man seeks to attain, to reach the heavens. He seeks to attain the heavens, not in merely physical terms, but through his strength, which involves primarily strength of character, virtue, right? Which is to say his excellence, the excellence of all of his faculties. If he can gather all of his faculties, he can try to reach the heavens. Now, and so meet the gods and be in their company. Now, this heroic attempt to reach the heavens fails. It fails, and that is why the ancient world, or the pagan world in general, is the pre-modern pagan world, is a tragic world. The heroes fail. The heroes of classical antiquity fail. They fail to reach the heavens. This failure is proclaimed and redeemed with Christianity, but Christianity is rejected at its core with the modern world. The core of Christianity being, one might find out, Platonic. Now, let us bracket this problem because this formulation can invite misunderstandings and confusion, perhaps, and some even anger and resentment. But the modern take on Christianity is one involving the use of Christianity, and so the Christian God, the biblical God, as a justification for modern consciousness and its quest for the overcoming of death. How does modern man seek to overcome death? He doesn't try to do, and so reach the heavens. He doesn't try to do it in the ancient way, which was shown to be tragic. He cannot, he no longer understands tragedy. He's a very optimistic person. He's a progressive person. Modern man transfers himself collectively in the establishment of a machine. This machine is not, again, merely an object pitted against a subject or a collectivity of subjects. It is none other than the result of an historical process, as modern man calls it, through which the ego, the human consciousness of modern man, so the sense of certainty, consciousness is a sense of certainty, of knowledge that I have of myself as possession, a transfer into a form that will enable us to overcome death, not to fall back into the past. So memory, our memory, which is a constitutional element of consciousness, memory is going to be retained in a machine. Again, it is not merely that we are using a machine, but that we are transferring ourselves into this new machine that involves the transformation of human consciousness through the integration of objects, of the material. So we have an historical synthesis of matter or object, res extensa, extended stuff, and things that we can measure, and human consciousness. The categories of matter and mind, classical categories, are reduced to these terms. Mind is reduced to modern consciousness, assumed to be universal, and matter is reduced to res extensa. In this way, we can have a synthesis, an historical synthesis, as it is called, a progressive synthesis, that points to the rise of a new machine. And this new machine is the ultimate guarantor and ultimate realization, shall we say, or self-realization of modern man. Now, we see here that the rise of modern consciousness and the rise of modern technology, ultimately, involves an account of consciousness as evolving out of no consciousness, or at least subconsciousness. And this evolution makes use of classical categories, first and foremost, that of God. The old gods are eliminated, but God as a universal is appealed to justify this rise of modern consciousness and ultimately modern technology. And we see this, of course, already in the early modern prophets of freedom, of universal freedom. So, what do we have today? We have a technology that is supposed to be the ultimate consummation of consciousness, of all consciousness, because modern consciousness is assumed to be universal, really, and anything that falls short of it is simply something inferior, qualitatively inferior, and ultimately something that should be subsumed under the category of modern consciousness, spoken of as consciousness as such, just as we speak about modern science as such, without distinguishing anymore in everyday parlance classical or medieval science. These are simply um, stepping stones to the rise of a universal science. All right. So, what we have today is the rise of technology as the triumph of the modern will. And this modern will is going to find its perfection, divine perfection, in cosmic, uh, well, will, or cosmic power, rather. The power becomes will with, and ultimately affirmed with technology, which makes full use of power. Technology, of course, is supposed to tame nature by integrating it in itself. Right. We're to be optimistic about this. Of course, we're to be optimistic. What else could there be? We have an evolution. Everything is moving toward the future. And we don't have to worry about falling back into the past if our memory is retained in the machine, if we move toward this, um, this establishment of a technological society. Our bodies, they are physical bodies, are merely physical bodies, are to be thoroughly, shall we say, technologized, right? That is to say, integrated within the technological system. Is there an obstacle to the success of technology today? To the triumph of the optimism of modern rationalism? One might propose that uh, barbaric hordes are opposed to the triumph of modern rationalism as incarnated in the technological regime. But the irrational passions of men are easily integrated in the machine. What is an obstacle to, well, what in classical terms is the dehumanization of man, is precisely uh, everything that contributed to the rise of classical civilization. And so, fundamentally, a Platonic orientation of life. What does this involve? Let us consider this problem briefly. There is a classical alternative to modern mechanistic, ultimately technological rationalism. This alternative, this classical alternative, found its blooming in the Middle Ages. Now, parenthesis, we're so used to considering the Middle Ages as an age of obscurantism, but in fact, this age has been obscured by the rise of modern rationalism, technological mechanistic rationalism, and its will to power. Sometimes we inherit the mockeries that were articulated in the early modern world of medieval rationalism. And these mockeries blind us to the nature of that rationalism and to its successes. In spite of all that has been said on the wars of religion, it is helpful to understand that um, war in the modern world is not only horrific in the 20th century, but it is something that is um, postponed. Postponed in the respect that we prepare technologically for the elimination, the total elimination of humanity. So uh, we are perfectly capable of a total war. This was not an option in the Middle Ages. The problem of war is but one of the problems that we face today. The other is, of course, the reduction of rationalism to a technological mode of life that functions in the element of reflex and not of reflection. So, what is the key of medieval rationalism? Precisely reflection. Reflection, not reflex, not mechanical reflex, is the heart of life for the medieval rationalist. And this means, really, that the medieval rationalist is a herald of genuine, substantive freedom, because there is freedom only in reflection. And, well, reflex is just going to give you false freedom, or um, the assumption of freedom, the illusion of freedom, which may be manifest in a self-affirmation, a determination, which is implosive ultimately. But let us consider again, in some detail, the nature of medieval and really in general classical rationalism. For the classical man, there is no historical fate for the human species. In other words, a universal vision that is something we can grasp first, formally, as Kant might do, and then ultimately, historically, that we could grasp in terms of the technological regime. Consciousness remains a determination or mask of thought. It is not that thought belongs to the ego, but that the ego belongs to thought. The ego is not the thinking thing, but the thing that masks thought, a determination of thought, at the center of a world of, well, contents of consciousness. Contents of consciousness, but also and primarily contents of thought. Man finds himself lost in the middle of the world, but he is found by thought in the middle. The world does not belong to consciousness, it belongs to the thought that is grounding both consciousness and, shall we say, its objects. Now, what is thought itself, or in itself? And for the classical man, and ultimately for the medieval man, thought itself is a divine activity that orders all things, all its contents. Ultimately, the contents of our consciousness, which is to say the world of experience, the empirical universe, turns out to be the content of thought that is presupposed by our consciousness. And thought here is, again, we could speak of it as a divine activity that orders its contents. Man, in biblical terms, is an image of God. Well, we can translate it, this proposition, in terms of consciousness. Consciousness is an image of divine mind. With the modern setup, we have a rejection of this that owes its inception to what was called voluntarism. And we see voluntarism, of course, in the ancient world. We see instances of it, but voluntarism in the modern world involves the use of God for self-justification. And voluntarism has as its fundamental alternative, pure rationalism. Not modern rationalism, but a previous form of rationalism. Now, on account of modern rationalism, we are masters of our destiny. Or we are, at the very least, to become masters of our destiny, with the rise of technology, of course. But in earlier forms of rationalism, we are vicars, or middle terms. We could even say measures of all things, but in this sense of middle term, in a divine plane. There is no historical consciousness because there's no history in which we find ourselves, but a divine plan that is mysterious and not quantifiable, not reducible to temporal parameters that we can measure. What we have today is a progressive impulse aiming at the overcoming of the middle position, which is really that of the human being. The overcoming of the middle position involves the obscuring of the Platonic character, nature of the human being as such. We could call it thus. It involves a radical transformation of the human. What we are faced with today is a war between a Platonic man and a technological man, between man as middle between the obscurity of the world and the light, on the one hand, and man as seeking to triumph over death in the machine. The machine that seeks to reconstruct death and make a world out of it, a world of death, a world that bespeaks death, a world that is somehow the apotheosis of death, turns death into a god. What is involved here is a conflict between a godless, fundamentally godless man, which is to say modern man, ultimately technological man, or the man that is completely integrated in technology, and the godly man, who is essentially a Platonist. And by this expression, what should be understood is someone who sees knowledge not as fundamentally matter of accumulation, but of return, of property, of being. What is involved here with the Platonic man is then gathering back of the contents of our experience into a world in which these contents are redeemed eternally, we could say, in a timeless manner, in the context of a divine agency, thought itself. So there we have it. This is the conflict that is at the heart of our times, the conflict, ultimately, between the godless and the godly.